Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll begin with chapter 4, verse 29. This is both this week's parsha, but it's also tomorrow morning's laning. The laning for Tisha B'Av morning is from this section where it talks about that there'll be times where you don't serve Hashem properly, and you'll find yourself in exile. And if you look, there's a very powerful pasuk or two here. You will seek out God from that place, and you will find Him. Because you will have sought Him out with all of your heart and all of your soul. Verse 30, when things are distressful for you, all these issues that we've spoken about find you. In the end of days, you will return to Hashem your God, and you'll listen to His voice. Verse 31, a very powerful passage to think about coming into Tisha B'Av. God is a merciful God. Your God is a merciful God. He will not let go of you. He will not destroy you. And He will not forget the covenant that He swore to your forefathers. There's just a very interesting sforno over here on Pasuk Chavtes. It runs into Pasuk Lamed. Sforno Pasuk Chavtes umatzasa. Afal pi she'ein sham mikdash v'lo klei kodesh. You know, you're there in the land of Israel. You have a temple. You have all these sacred things. You have all these sacred rules. You're living on top of the world. And then you get exiled. And you find yourself who knows where, dealing with who knows what, and you find God. Says the Sforno, you find God even though you don't have the sacred sanctuary, and even though you don't have the sacred vessels. How do you find God without those powerful tools? So he does a very interesting thing. He flows verse 29 into verse 30. The way we translated the pasuk is, you'll find God because you'll seek Him out with all your heart and all of your soul. The Sforno says, right? You'll seek Him out with your heart and soul when things are difficult for you. V'atam shetimtza'enu hu ki amnam tizrushenu b'chol levavcha meirov hatzaros. The reason you'll find Him is because you'll seek Him out with all of your heart because of all of the problems. And that's an amazing thing to think about. And again, extremely apropos coming into Tisha B'Av. It could be that the sorrows that befall us, the travails that befall us are a tool for us to come closer to God. Because we do, though we don't think this necessarily, it's clear in the Torah, and it's certainly clear anecdotally, we do a lot better with the coming close to God thing when things aren't going our way. So the greatest way to come close to God is in His holy Beis HaMikdash. But if we don't merit that, then sometimes the fact that we have problems is the greatest way to come close to Him. Just a very interesting thing to think about just in our lives in general. And again, I think it's very apropos for Tisha B'Av. Okay, moving on to verse 41. So Moshe Rabbeinu has given the Jews all kinds of talk about the importance of the mitzvos, the importance of remembering the scene of Har Sinai, the importance of perspective down the road when things don't go their way. And then this really seems to be utterly out of left field. Verse 41, Az Yavdil Moshe Shalosh Arim Be'ever Har Yarden. Then Moshe will set aside 3 cities on, before crossing the Jordan, Mizrach HaShamesh to the east. What are these cities about? Verse 42, Lanos Shama Rotzeach, that a person who kills someone can flee there. What kind of murderer? Asher Yitzachas Re'eu B'vlidas, when a person kills someone unintentionally, Vuso Lo Sonei Lo Mitmo Shoshom, he's not a person who had a hateful relationship with him. This person, the unintentional murderer, can flee to one of these cities and live. And this is the famous idea of the Ir Miklat, the city of refuge. Moshe set aside 3 of the Arei Miklat on the other side of Jordan, because we know, of course, that there would be Jews living on the other side of the Jordan as well. This really seems to be out of left field. First Rashi on Pasuk Mamalef, Az Yavdil, Nasan Leiv, Lios Chared Ladavar Sheyavdilem. It occurred to him. See, Rashi's interested in the wording of Yavdil. Yavdil means he will separate. What do you mean he will separate? It's not he will separate, it's he did separate. But and Rashi has this different places in Chumash that sometimes the future tense means he decided to himself that it was something that he should do. Moshe Rabbeinu said to himself, I really should separate these cities, and he did it. Now, this is a very strange thing because the halacha is that Arei Miklat are only operational. Cities of refuge only work once all of them are operational. So these cities of refuge before crossing the Jordan, if somebody would kill unintentionally that day, there'd be no reason to run to the city of refuge. There'd be no halach of the city of refuge till the Jewish people set up cities of refuge in Israel. So it's totally premature. This is what Moshe is doing on the end of his time in this world, setting up something that's not even practical right now. Omer Moshe said, mitzvah she'efshar l'kaima akai mena. A mitzvah that it's possible for me to fulfill, I want to take the opportunity to fulfill it. Very interesting Rashi. If you jump over to the Kli Yakar on Pasuk Mem Aleph, Az Yavdil Moshe Shalosh Harim, Bekishur Pasuk Zemin Kodem, Yatzam Mefarshim Lil Kot, V'lo Matzu Bir Maspik. The Kli Yakar says, we already touched on this. It's difficult to understand what the real connection is between Moshe's speech to the Jewish people and setting aside cities of refuge, and more so, something we didn't touch on, Umahu Lashon Az. Why does it say then Moshe set aside these 3 cities? If it wouldn't have said then, I would have understood that it was at that moment. V'yata hatei aznecha u'shma. So he says, I want to tell you something. Ki matzinu she'adam mascha b'mitzvah af al pi she'eini yachol lavo lidei gemar al yado. We have it all the time that a person could begin a mitzvah even though he's not going to bring it to completion. It's not going to be possible for him to bring it to completion. Mikol makom mitzvah shaba liyado chayev l'kaima. A mitzvah that comes his way, he's obligated to do it. Fascinating thing that David HaMelech very much wanted to build the temple. God told him, you're not going to build the temple. Your son is going to build the temple. David set aside raw materials for the building of the temple because that was something that he could do, though he couldn't be involved in the actual building of the temple. You could say, why should he set aside that gold? What a waste of resources. It's not going to be during his lifetime anyway. Let the next generation worry about it. He began a mitzvah, even though he knew that he wouldn't finish it. Derech Mashal tonight brings a beautiful, beautiful parable to think about. Is zaking hanotea ilan le'esrog shel mitzvah. Imagine an elderly person planting an esrog tree. Takes an esrog tree many, many years to actually begin generating esrogim that could be used for a mitzvah. So he knows it's not going to be during his lifetime that anybody uses that esrog. His offspring will be able to go to that tree and get esrogim off the tree. And there's plenty of things like that in this world. The Kli Yakar says, look at the pasuk immediately before this pasuk. The end of Moshe's speech was, you should guard the laws and mitzvos which I command you today. They will be good for you and for your children. Excuse me. Rod Salomar, Shim Tavo Liyadcha Eza Mitzvah, Tekaima Hayom La'alter. Says the Kli Yakar, what it's saying in that pasuk is the Hayom part that I command you today. The simple way to understand the pasuk is the mitzvahs that I command you today, you should always observe. The Kli Yakar says, read the pasuk differently. Always observe the mitzvahs that I've commanded you. And if you have the opportunity, do it today. If you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, do it right away. Even if the effect of the mitzvah might not be apparent today. Maybe the mitzvah won't be completed in your lifetime. Maybe only your children will complete the mitzvah. Mikomakom tasa mitzvah hayom la'alter. If you have an opportunity to even do part of a mitzvah today, do it. Kidei sheyitav lecha. So it'll be good for you. Ratzalomar shebiyadcha legomra. Bein sheyitav levonecha acharecha. So he says, the end of the pasuk says, so it'll be good for you and your children after you. Says the Kli Yakar, you know what it means? If you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah today, do it. Maybe you'll have the opportunity to finish the mitzvah. Maybe it'll be good for you. Maybe your children will have the opportunity to finish the mitzvah. But start the ball rolling. Nemar az yavdil Moshe shalosh arim, skipping a line or two. Then, after that pasuk, it says Moshe then decided to set aside 3 cities. Afal pishein and koltos ad shibadu osan shalosh ba'aretz. Even though, as we said, they're not halachically operative yet. Mikomakom amar Moshe mitzvah shabal liyadi akaimenes. Moshe said, I have to listen to my own preaching. If I have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, even partially, let me do it right now. V'zeu loshon az. That, says the Kli Yakar, is why it says then. Kishali meres Yisrael inyan zeh b'pasuk hakodem. When Moshe taught the Jewish people this point, miyad asu alach lamasa b'kayotzibo. He immediately did something practical of a mitzvah, k'dei shemimenu yiru v'chinyasu b'chol haTorah mitzvoseh, so that they would learn from him and they would act that way with all of the Torah and mitzvos. It's a very interesting Kli Yakar to think about. Let's jump ahead. Chapter 5, verse 6. In part of Moshe's recounting of all these things, he talks about, as we've said already, talks about the giving of the Torah, he talks about Har Sinai, and he talks about the 10 Commandments. Now, I just want to look very briefly at something really interesting over here. Verse 6, Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeisecha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeis avodim. I am Hashem, your God, who took you out of Egypt. That's pretty much like the first run through that we had in Parshas Yisro. Verse 7, Lo yeh lecha Elohim achirim al ponai. Don't have other gods. That's like Yisro. Verse 8, Lo saseh lecha fesel kol tmuna asher b'shamayim mal v'asher b'aretz b'tochas v'asher b'mayim b'tachas la'aretz. Don't make idols, things like that. Don't bear God's name falsely. And now in verse 12, we have something totally different. Shamras Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. Guard the day of Shabbos, as opposed to Zachar Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. Remember the day of Shabbos. And there are other famous differences between this version of the Aseret Dibros and the version of the Aseret Dibros in Parshas Yisro. The Ramban has a really interesting perspective on this. I just want to see it very quickly. Ramban on Pasuk Vav. So now Moshe begins telling them the 10 Commandments. He didn't change an iota in the first 2. Why? He didn't need to change anything in the first 2 because they heard it themselves. They heard the first 2 themselves. It's because he was just quoting what they already heard. He doesn't really change anything in the 3rd because this is really elaborated on earlier in Sefer Dvarim. This is already elaborated on in Parshas Kedoshim. But the point, says the Ramban, is that the other instructions, the other mitzvos, weren't heard directly, because only the first 2 were heard directly by the Jewish people. So Moshe Rabbeinu now feels that he needs to give more of a sense of what we're talking about here. Just interesting. So that's why there are differences, he says, because he needs to explain different components. It's a very interesting pshat to think about. Okay, so we discussed this morning the Sforno with seeking out God in a time of exile. We discussed the Rashi about Moshe Rabbeinu setting up the cities of refuge. We discussed the very interesting Kli Yakar about that idea. And then we discussed the Ramban with an interesting perspective on the difference between the 2 versions of the 10 Commandments.